I never imagined that the moment that changed my life would start with my father being laughed at by a room full of strangers. Not yelled at, not threatened, laughed at. There is something about public humiliation that sticks to your skin in a way anger never does. Even now, years later, I can still see my father's face in that room, still hear those people laughing, still remember the way he stared down at the floor like he suddenly wished he could disappear. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 33 years old, a structural engineer based in Philadelphia. And this story started on a rainy Tuesday evening when my father and I attended a city planning meeting downtown. My dad, Richard Carter, was 70 years old at the time. He had spent over 4 decades working as an engineer before retiring. Growing up, I thought my father knew everything. If something broke, he fixed it. If something didn't make sense, he explained it. If I had a problem, he somehow already knew the answer before I finished asking the question. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He wasn't the richest. He wasn't connected. But he understood things, especially buildings, especially foundations, especially what happens when people start cutting corners because they're blinded by money. The meeting that night was packed. Local officials, developers, reporters, community members, investors, everybody seemed excited about a massive luxury tower proposed for the waterfront district. The man presenting the project was named Brandon Hale. He was 40 years old, sharp suit, expensive watch, perfect smile, the kind of guy who looked like he practiced confidence in front of a mirror every morning. He was the CEO of Apex Urban Holdings, one of those development firms that always seem to have money for giant projects, but never enough money for questions. Brandon stood at the podium showing glossy renderings of a 30-story glass tower that would supposedly transform the city skyline. Every slide got applause. Every promise got nods from the audience. Jobs, revenue, economic growth, luxury residences, waterfront revitalization. It all sounded wonderful. Then my father quietly raised his hand. I remember looking over at him and smiling because I already knew what was coming. Dad never attended meetings like that unless something bothered him. A city official pointed toward him. "Yes, sir, go ahead." My father stood up slowly and adjusted his glasses. His voice wasn't confrontational. It wasn't angry. It was just curious. "I was reviewing the location of the proposed site," he said. "If I'm not mistaken, that section of waterfront was filled using reclaimed material nearly a century ago. Could you explain what foundation system you're planning to use and whether the soil reports are available for public review?" Simple question. Fair question. The kind of question any responsible engineer would ask. For a second, Brandon just stared at him. Then he smiled. At first, I thought he was going to answer. Instead, he laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not nervous laughter. A real laugh. The kind designed to embarrass someone. "Well," Brandon said into the microphone, "that's certainly one way to tell everyone you haven't worked in construction for about 50 years. Some people chuckled. My stomach tightened. Dad remained standing. Brandon continued. "Sir, we've got an entire team of professionals handling the engineering. I appreciate your concern, but maybe leave the technical work to people who actually do this for a living." More laughter. Louder this time. My father tried to respond. I was simply asking whether Brandon cut him off. "Come on, let's be honest. Nobody came here tonight for an engineering lecture from Grandpa." That one hit the room like gasoline on a fire. People laughed. Some looked uncomfortable. Others didn't. I remember hearing someone behind me snort. Another person actually clapped. My father's face changed. It wasn't anger. That would have been easier to watch. It was disappointment. The kind that comes when someone loses faith in people. He slowly sat down without saying another word. The meeting continued like nothing happened. Nobody stopped it. Nobody defended him. Nobody even asked for the question to be answered. They just moved on to the next presentation slide while my father stared at his folded hands. 20 minutes later, he quietly stood up and left. I followed him outside. Rain was falling across the courthouse steps. He stood there looking out toward the street. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then I finally said, "Dad, forget that guy." He forced a smile. "It's all right." "No, it's not. Emily." He paused. "People like him don't bother me." But I knew he was lying, because his eyes were red. My father never cried. Not when Mom died. Not when he had heart surgery. Not when he lost friends he'd known his whole life. Yet somehow one arrogant developer had managed to hurt him in less than 2 minutes. We started walking toward the parking garage. Halfway there, he suddenly stopped. That building won't last. I looked at him. What? That tower? He shook his head. Something's wrong. You know that from one presentation? He gave a small shrug. 45 years in engineering teaches you to recognize when someone is avoiding a question. I laughed a little. You think they're hiding something? He looked back toward the courthouse. I don't think they're hiding something. Then he said the sentence that would end up destroying a multi-million-dollar project. I think they're hiding everything. At the time, I didn't realize how serious he was. I figured he was upset, maybe even embarrassed. But over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The location, the reclaimed waterfront, the unanswered question, the way Brandon instantly turned to mockery instead of facts. Most engineers love talking about their work. If someone asks about a foundation system, we don't get offended. We explain it, unless we don't want people looking too closely. 3 days later, I pulled up the project files online and started reading. At first, I was just trying to prove Dad wrong. Honestly, I wanted to reassure him. I wanted to tell him that Brandon was an arrogant jerk, but the project itself was legitimate. Instead, within 20 minutes, I found something that made my stomach drop. Then I found something worse. And by midnight, I was staring at my computer screen, realizing that the man who humiliated my father may have accidentally started the biggest mistake of his entire career. The next morning, I woke up telling myself I was being ridiculous. Engineers are trained to question things. And sometimes when you start looking for problems, you convince yourself they're everywhere. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and planned to spend maybe 30 minutes reviewing the project before moving on with my day. 30 minutes turned into 12 hours. The first thing that bothered me was the foundation summary buried deep inside the permit package. Most people would never read it. Honestly, most reporters wouldn't even know where to find it. But engineers live in footnotes and appendices. That's where the truth usually hides. According to the documents, Apex Urban Holdings planned to support a 30-story tower using a foundation system that looked suspiciously shallow for the location. At first, I assumed I was missing something. Maybe there had been recent soil improvements. Maybe they had discovered a stronger bearing layer. Maybe a new geotechnical survey changed the assumptions. So I started digging through every public record I could find. By lunchtime, I had spread documents across my dining room table like a detective chasing a serial killer. Historical maps, soil reports, waterfront redevelopment plans, old engineering studies, environmental assessments. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The project site sat directly on reclaimed ground created nearly a century earlier. Not natural soil, feed material, debris, construction waste, layers of unstable material deposited over decades. Any competent engineer looking at that site would immediately understand the challenge. If you wanted a tower that size to remain stable long-term, you needed deep foundations extending to competent strata far below the surface. That wasn't an opinion. It wasn't a preference. It was reality. Yet the approved design seemed to ignore basic engineering principles. I called an old colleague named Marcus who specialized in geotechnical engineering. We had worked together on several large projects over the years, and I trusted his judgment completely. I sent him a few pages and asked what he thought. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Emily, he said, "Where did you get these?" "Public records. These can't be right." That's exactly what I said. There was silence for a moment. Then he added, "If this information is accurate, I wouldn't want my family living in that building." Hearing another engineer say it out loud made the situation feel real. Suddenly, this wasn't about my father anymore. It wasn't about an insult. It wasn't about pride. Hundreds of future residents could be affected if those documents reflected what was actually being built. Over the next week, I became obsessed. Every evening after work, I sat at my dining room table surrounded by records. Friends invited me out, and I declined. My sister called and asked if I was dating anyone. I told her I was currently in a committed relationship with municipal archives. She laughed. I wasn't joking. One night around 11, I discovered something that changed everything. I found two versions of what appeared to be the same soil analysis. At first glance, they looked identical. Same company, same formatting, same signatures, but the numbers didn't match. Certain load-bearing values have been altered, not dramatically, just enough to support the proposed design. My heart started pounding. Engineers make mistakes. Data entry errors happen. But this didn't look accidental. This looked deliberate. I printed both reports and laid them side by side. The differences were impossible to ignore. Then I noticed something even stranger. One of the signatures belonged to an engineer I vaguely recognized. After some searching, I found his professional contact information and sent a cautious email asking whether he had participated in the study. I expected no response. Instead, he called me the next afternoon. His first sentence nearly knocked me out of my chair. I never signed that report. For a second, I thought I misunderstood him. What do you mean? I mean, that's not my signature, and those are my conclusions. I felt a chill run through my entire body. He explained that his firm had conducted preliminary evaluations years earlier, but the final document attached to the permit package was not the report they produced. We spoke for nearly an hour. By the end of the conversation, I realized I was no longer investigating negligence. I was investigating fraud. That evening, I drove to my father's house. He lived alone in a modest brick home outside the city, the same house where my sister and I grew up. He answered the door carrying a watering can because apparently retired engineers develop an emotional attachment to tomato plants. I walked inside and spread documents across his kitchen table. He studied them quietly. Every few minutes, he'd adjust his glasses and nod. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. You found it. Found what? The reason he got defensive. I sat down across from him. Dad, if this is real, people could go to prison. He looked at the documents again. Good. That answer surprised me. My father was usually the most forgiving person I knew. He believed everyone deserved second chances. He believed most mistakes came from poor judgment rather than bad intentions. But that night, there was something different in his eyes. Do you know why engineers carry responsibility? He asked. Because people trust what we build. I nodded. People walk across bridges because they trust us. Families sleep in buildings because they trust us. If somebody lies about safety for money, they're not just breaking rules. They're gambling with lives. For the next month, my life revolved around evidence. Every lunch break, every weekend, every spare hour, I documented everything. Permit inconsistencies, engineering discrepancies, financial connections, regulatory approvals. One discovery led to another. Through public disclosures, I identified unusual payments connected to a city inspector assigned to the project. The transactions themselves weren't proof of anything, but they raised serious questions. Then another source provided information suggesting that internal concerns had been dismissed during the approval process. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. By the time I finished, my report exceeded 100 pages. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. It wasn't revenge. It was facts. Engineering calculations, documentation, comparisons, timelines, supporting evidence. Every statement referenced. Every conclusion supported. When I finally placed the completed report on my desk, I remember staring at it for several minutes. It represented thousands of hours of work. Months earlier, I had simply wanted answers. Now I was holding something that could potentially destroy an entire development company. The question was what to do next. The answer arrived after another conversation with my father. We were sitting on his porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the horizon. He listened as I explained my options. Professional licensing boards, city agencies, regulatory investigators, attorneys, journalists. When I finished, he nodded slowly. What would happen if you stayed quiet? I already knew the answer. Construction continues. And if you're right, I looked toward the dark clouds. Eventually, people get hurt. Dad took a sip of coffee. Then it sounds like your decision has already been made. The following Monday, I submitted formal complaints to every appropriate authority I could identify. State regulators, building officials, professional licensing boards, ethics investigators. Every package contained the same evidence. Every claim was documented. Every conclusion supported. Then I waited. Honestly, I expected nothing to happen. Large developers have lawyers, connections, influence, money. People like Brandon Hale don't usually face consequences. They write checks and problems disappear. At least that's what I believed. Then week 1 arrived. Calls started coming in. Investigators requested additional documentation. Agencies acknowledged receipt. Review panels opened inquiries. By week 2, the city ordered an independent engineering assessment. That's when Brandon finally noticed me. The first email from his legal team landed in my inbox on a Thursday morning. It was polite on the surface, but the message underneath was obvious. Back off. Stop asking questions. Stop causing problems. I forwarded it to my attorney and kept working. 2 days later, another letter arrived. Then another. Then phone calls. Pressure started building from every direction. Friends warned me that powerful companies rarely lose fights like this. Some even suggested I walk away before things got ugly. Maybe they were right. Maybe I should have. But every time doubt crept in my mind, I remember my father sitting silently in that meeting while strangers laughed at him for asking a question that turned out to be completely valid. And as the independent inspectors began reviewing the site, one thought kept repeating in my head. Brandon Hale had no idea how much trouble he was actually in. A few weeks later, everything started falling apart for Brandon Hale. The independent engineering review came back, and almost every major concern I'd raised was confirmed. The foundation design was inadequate for the site conditions. Critical documents were being questioned, and regulators immediately expanded their investigation. Suddenly, the man who had stood in front of hundreds of people acting untouchable was spending his days answering questions from attorneys and investigators. Then came the moment Brandon finally reached out. His legal team requested a meeting, hoping to convince me to back off. We sat across from each other in a conference room downtown, and for the first time since that city meeting, he didn't look confident. He looked worried. After several minutes of legal talk, Brandon finally looked at me and asked, "Why are you doing this?" I couldn't help but laugh. Not because it was funny, but because he genuinely didn't understand. "Do you remember the older engineer you humiliated at the planning meeting?" I asked. He stared at me for a moment before recognition hit him. That was my father. The room went silent. "The question you mocked was the exact question that exposed your entire project." For the first time, Brandon had nothing to say. Within months, the project was officially suspended. Investors began pulling out. Regulatory agencies continued uncovering problems, and the company's reputation collapsed faster than anyone expected. The luxury tower that was supposed to define Brandon's career became the reason it unraveled. Eventually, the development lost its permits, financing disappeared, and the project was abandoned altogether. Apex Urban Holdings never recovered. A year later, the property was sold to a new ownership group that wanted to do things the right way. They hired my engineering firm to redesign the foundation from scratch. And for the first time, the project was built on actual engineering instead of shortcuts. When my first consulting payment arrived, I drove straight to my father's house. He was sitting on the back porch drinking coffee when I handed him the envelope. He looked at the check, then looked back at me. "You earned this," he said. I shook my head. "No, you did." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I smiled. "You were right from the beginning." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he nodded and looked out across the yard. That was who my father always was. He never needed applause. He never needed recognition. He only cared about being honest and doing things the right way. Looking back, I don't think Brandon's biggest mistake was the bad engineering. It was believing that experience didn't matter simply because it came from an older man standing in the audience instead of someone wearing an expensive suit on stage. If he had answered one simple question with respect, none of this might have happened. But arrogance has a strange way of uncovering the very thing it's trying to hide. So now I want to ask you something. Was this justice? Was it karma? Or did Brandon simply destroy himself the moment he chose ego over integrity? Let me know what you think in the comments, because after everything that happened, I'm still curious where people draw the line between accountability and revenge.